I want you to picture something. You're 68 years old, sitting in a small conference room at your own bank, and a loan officer you've never met before slides a piece of paper across the table and asks you very carefully whether you're aware that your home has a second mortgage on it, taken out 14 months ago, for an amount that very nearly equals what the house is worth. And you have to sit there in front of a stranger and admit out loud that you had absolutely no idea any such thing existed, because the man who arranged it was someone you had trusted with every single dollar you and your late husband had spent 40 years saving. My name is Diane Porter. I'm 69 years old now, and 18 months ago I discovered that my own son-in-law, a licensed financial advisor named David Pruitt, who had managed my investments for nearly 3 years after my husband Robert passed away, had systematically drained almost everything we had, borrowed against my house without my full understanding of what I was signing, and left me at 68 years old with a fraction of what I believed I had, and a daughter who, when I first told her what I'd discovered, did not believe me. I want to tell you exactly how that happened, how it very nearly cost me my relationship with my only child, and how I ended up rebuilding an entire life for myself on an island in the Philippines called Palawan, on considerably less money than I ever imagined I'd have to live on at this age, and somehow ending up happier than I had been in years. I need to back up considerably because I don't think any of this makes sense without understanding exactly how much trust I placed in one single person and exactly why. Robert and I were married for 43 years. We met in Savannah, Georgia, where I grew up and where we both lived our entire married life. He as a civil engineer for the county, me teaching high school English for 31 years at the same school. We were careful people, the kind who paid off our mortgage early, who maxed out retirement contributions whenever we could, who genuinely believed, right up until the final years of Robert's life, that we had done everything correctly, that we would be secure no matter what came. Robert died of a sudden cardiac event 5 years ago, 66 years old, gone within an hour of his first symptom, with no warning at all. Our daughter Melissa was 38 at the time, married to David, a financial advisor who worked for a regional firm and who had, over the years, occasionally offered casual advice at family dinners about our retirement accounts. Advice Robert and I had always politely acknowledged without acting on, since we'd managed our own modest portfolio ourselves for decades without much trouble. After Robert died, I found myself, for the first time in my adult life, entirely responsible for financial decisions I had always shared with him. I want to be honest that this terrified me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Robert had handled most of our investment decisions, not because I wasn't capable, but simply because it had fallen naturally into his half of our division of labor over 4 decades of marriage, the way these things quietly do. Suddenly, at 64 years old, grieving and disoriented, I was staring at account statements full of terminology I only half understood, and my son-in-law, seeing my distress at a family dinner about 3 months after the funeral, offered, gently and what seemed at the time like generously, to simply take over managing things for me. "Diane, you don't need to worry about any of this," he told me. "Let me handle it. That's literally what I do for a living, and it's the least I can do for you and Melissa both." I want to explain why I said yes so readily, because I think it matters enormously to the rest of this story. David had been part of our family for 12 years at that point. He'd walked Melissa down the aisle's rehearsal dinner toast beside Robert. He'd been kind to us, present at every holiday, generous with his time. I trusted him not simply because he had professional credentials, though he did, but because he was family, and because grief in those early months had left me with very little energy to scrutinize decisions I desperately wanted someone else to simply take off my plate. I also want to be honest about something else, which is how isolating that first year of widowhood had already made me, entirely apart from the financial situation. Several of the couples Robert and I had socialized with for decades quietly, gradually drifted away in the months following his death, the way a widow so often discovers happens, no longer quite fitting the dinner party arrangements built around pairs. My closest remaining friend from those years, a woman named Carol I'd known since our own children were in elementary school together, remained a steady presence. But even she, I think, underestimated how completely unmoored I felt handling decisions Robert had always quietly managed. When David offered to simply take over, he was not only offering financial expertise, he was offering to remove one enormous source of anxiety from a life that already felt, in those months, considerably more fragile than it ever had before. For the first year or so, everything appeared entirely normal. David would send me quarterly summaries, simplified reports showing modest, steady growth, numbers that matched roughly what I expected given market conditions at the time. I signed documents when he brought them to me, mostly at family gatherings, always with an explanation that sounded reasonable, always framed as routine account maintenance or minor rebalancing. I did not, I will freely admit now, read those documents nearly as carefully as I should have. I trusted the person handing them to me more than I scrutinized the content itself, a mistake I have had a great deal of time to reflect on since. The first small sign that something might be wrong came about 2 years after Robert's death, when I mentioned, in passing, wanting to use some of my savings to help my granddaughter, Melissa and David's oldest daughter, with a portion of her college tuition the following year. David's reaction: a slight but noticeable hesitation, a vague comment about the account being a bit tighter than usual right now due to some rebalancing, struck me as odd at the time, but I didn't push the matter, again, trusting that he understood the situation better than I did. The actual discovery, when it finally came, happened almost by accident, and I want to describe it exactly as it occurred, because I think the ordinariness of the moment makes it somehow more unsettling in retrospect. I received a letter in the mail, addressed to me directly rather than through David's office, from a mortgage servicing company I had never heard of, referencing a home equity loan on my house that I had, as far as I knew, never taken out. I assumed initially that it was some kind of scam mailing, the sort of thing retirees receive constantly, and nearly threw it away without a second thought. Some small instinct I'm grateful I listened to, made me instead drive to my actual bank the following morning and ask a loan officer to simply check the public records on my property. I remember standing at that bank counter, waiting for the loan officer to pull up the records, still fully expecting her to tell me the letter was simply an error, one of the countless mailing mistakes that plague anyone whose name and address exist in enough databases. I remember the specific shift in her expression, professional but visibly careful, when the record actually loaded on her screen, and the way she asked, gently, whether I'd like to speak somewhere more private, before she explained what she was seeing. That request alone, before she'd said a single further word, told me something was genuinely wrong in a way the letter itself hadn't quite convinced me of yet. That was the conference room I described at the very beginning of this story. Sitting there, 68 years old, a woman who had spent 31 years teaching English to teenagers, being told by a stranger that my home, the home Robert and I had paid off entirely 15 years before he died, now carried a second mortgage worth nearly its full value, taken out 14 months earlier, with my signature on the paperwork. A signature I did recall providing, though at the time I had been told by David that I was signing routine documentation related to a minor restructuring of my investment accounts, nothing that involved my house at all. The loan officer, to her credit, was gentle but thorough, walking me through the actual document line by line, pointing out language I had genuinely never noticed, buried in the middle of a stack of papers David had brought to a family dinner nearly 15 months earlier, papers I had signed between courses of a meal Melissa had cooked, distracted by my granddaughter's chatter at the far end of the table, trusting the man across from me completely enough that I hadn't read a single page as carefully as I would have read a student's essay decades earlier in my classroom. I drove home from that bank in a state I can only describe as a kind of controlled shock, the sort where your hands function well enough to operate a car, but your mind is entirely elsewhere. I called David that same afternoon, as calmly as I could manage, and asked him to explain exactly what had happened to that loan money and where my actual investment accounts currently stood. His explanation, delivered smoothly, almost rehearsed in its calm, involved a complicated story about a real estate investment opportunity he'd identified, one he assured me was performing well, that simply required this particular financing structure for tax reasons, he explained in language dense enough that I did not, in that moment, fully follow it. I asked directly to see current statements for all of my actual accounts, the ones Robert and I had built over 4 decades. It took David nearly a week to produce them, an unusual delay from a man who had always been prompt with quarterly summaries in the past. And when the statements finally arrived, the numbers bore almost no resemblance to what I had believed, based on his prior reports, that I actually possessed. Nearly 70% of what Robert and I had saved across our entire working lives together was simply gone, redirected, David explained, into that same real estate venture and several others I had never once been consulted about in any meaningful detail, despite having signed documents that, I came to understand only in retrospect, had authorized exactly this kind of activity in language too dense for me to have reasonably understood at the time I signed it. I called Melissa that same evening, my own daughter, and told her everything I'd discovered. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think it's one of the most painful parts of this entire story. She did not believe me, not fully, not at first. Mom, David's been doing this professionally for 20 years. Are you sure you're not just confused about how investments work? Sometimes the numbers go down before they go back up. I understood, even in that moment, that she wasn't being cruel, that she was defending her husband and the life they'd built together, a life that included 2 children and a mortgage of their own that, I would learn much later, David had also been quietly manipulating to cover losses in whatever speculative ventures he'd actually been pursuing behind everyone's backs. The following months were, without question, the most painful of my entire adult life, harder in some ways than losing Robert had been, because Robert's death, however devastating, had at least been an honest, unambiguous loss. This was different. This was watching my only child choose, for a period of nearly 4 months, to believe her husband's careful explanations over her own mother's lived experience, while I hired an attorney at considerable additional expense I could barely afford at that point to formally investigate exactly what had happened to my accounts. I want to describe one particular evening from that period because I think it captures something the general devastation doesn't fully explain. About 2 months into the investigation, Melissa came to my house, alone, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had eaten every meal of our married life together. And she said, carefully, "Mom, David says you're being manipulated by your lawyer into seeing this in the worst possible light. He says these kinds of investments are normal and you just don't understand the risk profile you agreed to." I sat across from my own daughter, 68 years old, and I felt something break inside me that I don't believe has ever fully healed. The specific, particular pain of not being believed by the one person in the world I most needed to believe me. The attorney's investigation, once it fully unfolded over the following several months, revealed a pattern considerably worse than even I had initially feared. David had not simply made a series of poor investment choices. He had, according to the forensic accounting my attorney eventually commissioned, been quietly diverting funds from my accounts for nearly 2 full years, using a portion to cover mounting personal debts of his own that had nothing whatsoever to do with any real estate venture. Debts I later learned stemmed from a gambling habit he had successfully concealed from Melissa and everyone else in the family for years. I want to describe the moment I learned about the gambling specifically because it recontextualized so much of what had come before it. My attorney called me on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, her voice careful in the particular way professionals adopt when delivering news they know will land hard, and explained that the forensic accountants had traced a consistent pattern of withdrawals coinciding with online sports betting platforms and, on several occasions, actual trips to casinos in Mississippi that David had told Melissa were work conferences. I sat with that information for a long while after hanging up, turning over years of family dinners, holidays, ordinary Tuesday phone calls, wondering how much of the man I thought I'd known for 12 years had simply been a performance sustained by increasingly desperate financial pressure I'd never once suspected. Melissa, when the gambling specifically came to light, several weeks into the broader investigation, finally began to shift, though even then not entirely. I knew he'd been distracted, distant sometimes, she admitted to me on a phone call I remember with painful clarity. But I genuinely never suspected anything like this. I feel like I didn't know my own husband at all. I understood, hearing the shock in her voice, that she was beginning her own version of the same reckoning I'd already been living through for months. And while some part of me wanted her simply to have believed me sooner, a larger part recognized that she was grieving her own particular loss, the marriage she'd believed she had, in ways that would take her considerably longer to fully process than the straightforward financial facts alone. By the time the full picture emerged, I had lost roughly 75% of everything Robert and I had built together across 4 decades of careful, disciplined saving. My house, once fully paid off, now carried a mortgage I had no realistic way of servicing on my modest teacher's pension alone. And my relationship with Melissa, my only child, had fractured in a way I genuinely did not know during those darkest months whether it would ever properly heal. Carol, my one steady remaining friend from all those years, was the person who kept me functional during that stretch, driving me to attorney appointments I was too shaken to manage alone, sitting with me on evenings when the weight of everything felt entirely unbearable. She was also the one who gently pointed out, about 3 months into the investigation, that I had started avoiding several longtime acquaintances entirely, ashamed, in a way I hadn't fully admitted even to myself, of what had happened, as though being defrauded by my own son-in-law somehow reflected some personal failing on my part, rather than a deliberate deception by someone who had spent years building exactly the trust required to make it possible. Diane, she told me one evening, you did not do anything wrong except love your family. Please stop talking about this like it was your mistake. I have thought about that sentence often in the years since, because I think it took me considerably longer to actually believe it than it took Carol to say it. The state's licensing board, once formally notified through my attorney, opened its own separate investigation into David's professional conduct, a process that would ultimately take considerably longer than my own personal financial reckoning did, but which eventually, months after I'd already made the decision that would change my life, resulted in the suspension of his license and a separate criminal referral regarding the specific misappropriation of client funds. A legal process I want to be careful not to describe in more detail than I actually know for certain, since some elements remained, even as I record this, still working their way through the courts. What I knew with absolute certainty, sitting in my kitchen about 5 months after that first bank conference room, was considerably simpler and more urgent than any legal proceeding. I was 68 years old. I had lost the great majority of my savings. My home carried a debt I could not sustainably pay on a teacher's pension alone. And I needed to make a decision, relatively quickly, about what the remaining years of my life were actually going to look like. I want to be honest that selling my house, the house Robert and I had raised Melissa in, the house that held 43 years of our shared life together, was one of the most painful decisions I have ever made all the more painful by the circumstances forcing it. But once the sale went through, and once my attorney had finished calculating exactly what remained, considerably less than I had ever imagined needing to survive on at this stage of my life, I understood that continuing to live in Savannah on the fixed income that remained was simply not a sustainable plan. Not if I wanted anything resembling a dignified, comfortable remaining chapter of my life. It was my cousin, Patricia, living in Charleston, who first mentioned the idea to me, almost offhandedly, during one of the many difficult phone calls we had during those months. Her own next-door neighbor's mother, she mentioned, had retired to somewhere in the Philippines several years earlier, on a budget considerably smaller than what I now had remaining, and seemed by every account Patricia had heard entirely content there. I remember my initial reaction being something close to dismissal, a vague sense that such a move was for people considerably more adventurous than a 68-year-old widowed English teacher whose own daughter currently wasn't speaking to her. But the idea, once planted, refused to fully leave me, the way ideas sometimes do when you're desperate enough for any path forward that doesn't involve simply watching your remaining savings dwindle in an American city where the cost of a dignified life had grown, I discovered upon actually running the numbers, considerably beyond what I now had to work with. I began researching, quietly, late at night, the way you research something you're not yet certain you'll actually follow through on. I read about a special retirement visa available to foreigners over 50. I found expat forums describing entire communities of American retirees, many of them, I discovered with some relief, in circumstances not unlike my own, financial setbacks that had made staying in America simply untenable. One name kept surfacing in my research, a place I had genuinely never heard of before that period, an island province called Palawan, and specifically a city there called Puerto Princesa, described repeatedly as one of the cleanest, safest, most livable smaller cities in the entire country, home to a famous underground river and a stretch of coastline that, in the photographs I found myself staring at late into the night, looked almost unreasonably beautiful for a place I could actually afford to live. After nearly 3 months of quiet research, I decided on something small and containable, the same way I imagine anyone facing a decision this large eventually talks themselves into taking the first concrete step. Just a trip, 10 days. I would see it with my own eyes, and if it turned out to be nothing more than a desperate fantasy built during the worst period of my life, I would come home and quietly figure out some other, harder path forward. I flew out of Savannah alone, 68 years old, carrying a version of grief and betrayal I still hadn't fully processed, toward a place I had known nothing about barely 3 months earlier. I landed in Manila first, spent one disoriented night there, and then took a short flight to Puerto Princesa, where a woman named Corazon, connected to me through an online expat forum where I'd been quietly asking questions for weeks, had offered to meet me and show me around for a few days. An act of generosity from a total stranger that struck me, even then, as almost unbelievable given everything I'd just been through with people who were supposed to be family. Corazon met me at the small airport, holding a hand-lettered sign with my name on it, and the city itself, from the very first drive out of that airport, surprised me in ways I hadn't expected. Cleaner than I'd imagined, genuinely calm, with wide, well-maintained roads and a palpable civic pride that Corazon explained over the following days came from the city's long-standing reputation as one of the most environmentally conscious and orderly places in the entire country, a reputation locals took visibly seriously. Corazon put me up in a modest guest house for those first several days, and on my second evening there, took me to see the famous Puerto Princesa subterranean river, an underground waterway running through a massive limestone cave system. And I remember sitting in that small boat, gliding through near total darkness, broken only by our guide's careful flashlight beam, thinking, for the first time since that conference room at my bank, about something other than betrayal, loss, and the daughter who currently wasn't speaking to me. I felt, if only for those 20 minutes in that dark ancient cave, something close to genuine wonder, an emotion I hadn't experienced in longer than I could measure. Corazon, over the following days, shared her own story with a frankness I hadn't expected from someone I'd known barely 48 hours. She'd worked for over 2 decades as a nurse in Riyadh, sending money home to support her own children's education, before finally returning to Puerto Princesa in her 50s to build the modest guest house business that now let her welcome exactly the kind of lost, uncertain American woman I currently was. Everyone who comes here is running from something or toward something, she told me over dinner one evening. Usually both at the same time. You don't have to explain yours to me, Diane. I have seen enough of them by now to recognize the shape of it. I found myself telling her the whole story anyway, over the course of that visit, in pieces, and she listened without once making me feel foolish for having trusted David in the first place, a kindness I hadn't fully received from anyone since the ordeal began, including, at that point, my own daughter. I toured a modest but well-regarded hospital during that visit, mostly out of the same practical instinct that had led me to actually verify David's story at my bank all those months earlier. And I found the costs, when I inquired directly, almost impossible to believe compared to what equivalent care would cost me in the United States, even accounting for the reduced Medicare coverage I now anticipated needing to supplement carefully, given my dramatically reduced retirement savings. A basic consultation ran a fraction of what I'd have paid even with insurance back in Savannah, and the hospital administrator who walked me through the general fee structure did so with a patience and thoroughness I hadn't experienced from any healthcare provider back home in years, unhurried by whatever schedule of appointments waited behind me. By the end of that 10-day trip, I knew, in the particular quiet way you know something before you fully admitted it to yourself in words, that this was where I needed to rebuild whatever remained of my life. I flew home to Savannah and spent nearly 2 more months finalizing the practical details, the visa paperwork, the final sale of what remained of my possessions, a process made considerably lonelier by the continued distance between myself and Melissa, who, even as my attorney's investigation moved steadily toward confirming everything I had originally told her, still had not fully reached out to repair what had broken between us. I flew out on a one-way ticket in early autumn, 68 years old, toward a life I could not have imagined for myself even a single year earlier, carrying considerably less than I had once believed I would have to build a retirement around, and considerably more uncertainty about my own daughter's place in whatever remained of my future. The small apartment I'd arranged, modest but comfortable, sat in a quiet residential area not far from the city center, and Corazon, who had become something close to a genuine friend over the course of my visit and the months of messages that followed, met me at the airport again, this time with a small bouquet of flowers rather than a hand-lettered sign, and helped me settle in over those first difficult days. I want to be honest that the first several weeks were considerably harder than my brief visit had prepared me for. The particular disorientation of building an entirely new daily life at 68 years old, in a place where I knew almost no one, while still carrying an open wound where my relationship with my only child used to be. There were mornings I woke in that unfamiliar apartment and simply lay there, uncertain what exactly the day ahead was supposed to consist of, uncertain whether I had made a wise decision or simply run as far from my problems as physically possible. What began to change things, gradually, was Corazon's insistence, about 6 weeks into my time there, that I meet a small group of women she gathered with most Saturday mornings at a modest cafe near the market, several of them widows themselves, a few of them, I discovered, with a particular shock of recognition, having navigated their own versions of financial hardship in their earlier lives before rebuilding something stable here. A woman named Felly, in particular, had lost her own late husband's small business to a dishonest business partner decades earlier, and listened to my story when I finally felt able to tell it fully, with an understanding that went considerably beyond simple sympathy. "You are not foolish for trusting family, Diane," she told me, taking my hand across that small cafe table. "You are only foolish if you never trust again because of what one bad person did to you." It was through that same group of women that I discovered, almost by accident, an opportunity that ended up giving my entire new life its shape and purpose. Corazon mentioned one Saturday morning that a local community organization was looking for volunteers to help run a basic financial literacy program aimed specifically at local women, many of them widows or wives of overseas workers, managing household finances largely on their own for the first time. Teaching basic budgeting, saving strategies, and, given my own particular and painful expertise, how to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation before it happened to them the way it had happened to me. I said yes almost before Corazon had finished describing it, with an eagerness that surprised even myself, given how thoroughly the entire subject of finances had come to terrify me over the preceding year. The very first session, sitting across from perhaps 15 women, ranging from their 30s to their 70s, I found myself, for the first time since that letter arrived in my mailbox all those months earlier, transforming the worst experience of my entire life into something that might actually protect someone else from living through the exact same devastation. There was one woman in particular, a quiet, serious widow in her 50s named Josephina, whose late husband's brother had, in the months following the funeral, attempted to convince her to sign over control of a small inherited property using exactly the kind of confusing, dense legal language David had once used with me. Josephina stayed after that very first session, wanting to understand in careful detail precisely what questions she should be asking before signing anything at all, and I walked her through it, drawing directly on the hardest lesson of my own life for nearly 2 hours, until she finally felt confident enough to face her brother-in-law's pressure with real, informed resistance. When she returned the following week to tell me she'd successfully protected her property, I felt a version of pride and purpose I genuinely had not expected to feel again at 69 years old, having believed for much of the preceding year that my usefulness in the world had been permanently diminished by everything I'd lost. The program grew steadily over the following months, word spreading, as it does in a smaller city, mostly through the women themselves rather than any formal advertising. A woman named Pressy, younger than most of the others, in her early 30s, came to me privately after one session to ask about a situation with her own husband's overseas earnings that she suspected, based on inconsistencies in the numbers he reported home, might not be entirely honest, and I helped her work through, gently and without judgment, exactly how to request the documentation she was entitled to see. I do not know, to this day, precisely how that situation ultimately resolved for her, since she eventually stopped attending sessions, but I have thought of her often and hoped, in the specific way you hope for someone whose full story you'll never fully learn, that she found whatever answers she needed. About 7 months into my time in Puerto Princesa, before that phone call from Melissa that would eventually come, I faced my own genuine test of whether the fragile new life I'd built here could actually hold up under real pressure. A typhoon, considerably stronger than the city typically experiences, was forecast to make a direct pass through the province, and I remember the specific, isolating fear of facing something like that entirely alone, thousands of miles from anyone who shared my last name, in an apartment I had lived in for barely half a year. Corazon, sensing my anxiety in the days leading up to it, simply appeared at my door the evening before the storm was set to arrive, a small overnight bag in hand. "You are not sitting through this alone, Diane. I already told my husband I am staying here." I tried weakly to insist she didn't need to, and she waved off the objection entirely, the way I'd come to understand people here so often do, when you attempt to decline exactly the kind of care they've already decided to give you. The storm hit hard that night, the power failing within the first hour. Wind bending the palm trees outside my window at an angle that frightened me considerably more than Corazon's calm demeanor suggested it should. We sat together by candlelight for nearly 4 hours, and at some point, somewhere in the middle of that dark, loud night, I found myself telling Corazon details about the entire ordeal with David that I hadn't even fully told my own attorney. The specific, particular humiliation of discovering that trust itself could be so thoroughly weaponized by someone who'd spent over a decade earning it deliberately. Corazon listened to every word without once interrupting, and when I finally finished, she simply reached over and held my hand in the candlelight and said, "That man is a thief who happened to also be family. Those are two different things, and you are allowed to grieve the family part without ever excusing the thief." I do not believe I fully understood, until she said it plainly like that, how much I had been unconsciously conflating the two. The power came back around 4 in the morning, and by the time the sun rose, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving fallen branches and a few downed power lines throughout the neighborhood, but nothing more serious. Corazon and I walked out together that morning to check on several of the other women from our Saturday group, finding at each stop neighbors already out clearing debris together without any particular coordination. The same instinct toward collective care I had by then come to recognize as something close to the defining character of the entire community I'd landed in almost by accident. About 8 months into my time in Puerto Princesa, I received a phone call that changed the entire remaining trajectory of this story. It was Melissa, and her voice, from the very first word, sounded different than it had in over a year. Careful and considerably less certain than the defensive tone I'd grown accustomed to during our worst months. The state licensing board's investigation, combined with a separate criminal referral my own attorney had pursued, had finally reached a point where the full extent of David's activities could no longer be reasonably disputed by anyone, including, finally, his own wife. Forensic accountants had traced not simply the funds taken from me, but a broader pattern of financial misconduct affecting several other clients as well, along with confirmation of the gambling debts that had originally driven the entire scheme. Melissa cried on that call in a way I hadn't heard from my own daughter since she was a small child. "Mom, I am so sorry. I should have believed you from the very first phone call. I let him convince me you were confused, and I will never forgive myself for that." I want to be honest that I did not immediately fully forgive her either, not in that single phone call, because the damage of those months when my own daughter chose her husband's careful explanations over my lived reality had cut deeper than a single tearful apology could immediately repair. But it was undeniably a genuine beginning. Melissa came to visit about 4 months after that call, her first time seeing the actual life I'd built rather than hearing about it through increasingly careful, rebuilding phone conversations. She landed nervous, I could tell, uncertain what exactly she would find, perhaps still carrying some residual worry that I had simply run from my problems rather than building something real. I showed her everything, the financial literacy program, where Josefina, by then a regular volunteer herself, greeted Melissa warmly and unprompted told her at some length about everything her mother had taught her about protecting herself. Corazon and Feli and the Saturday morning cafe gatherings that had become the backbone of my new life. On her second day, we took the boat tour through the subterranean river together, the same one Corazon had shown me on my very first visit. And sitting in that small boat, gliding through near total darkness, Melissa reached over at one point and took my hand, unprompted, the first genuinely warm, unguarded gesture she'd offered me since everything had fallen apart between us over a year earlier. Neither of us said anything for a while, simply sitting there together in that ancient, dark quiet. And I remember thinking that some conversations don't actually need words to begin repairing what's broken. That evening, over dinner at a small restaurant Corazon had recommended, Melissa asked me, carefully, what exactly had made me choose Palawan specifically, out of everywhere in the world I could theoretically have gone. I told her honestly that I hadn't chosen it for any particularly romantic reason, that I had simply needed somewhere my dramatically reduced savings could actually sustain a dignified life, and that the beauty and the community I'd found here had turned out to be an unexpected gift, layered on top of what had originally been, at its core, a purely financial necessity. I think that's almost more meaningful, she said, that you didn't go looking for some perfect fresh start. You just needed somewhere you could actually survive, and it turned into this instead. The moment that shifted something fully in her happened on her third day, sitting in on one of my sessions, watching me walk a room full of women considerably younger than either of us, through the exact warning signs that, had I recognized them myself years earlier, might have protected everything Robert and I had built together. Afterward, walking back to my apartment, Melissa was quiet for a long stretch before saying, Mom, you've turned the worst thing that ever happened to you into something that's actually protecting other people. I don't think I could have done that. I told her that I hadn't set out to do anything particularly noble, that I had simply needed something to do with the pain that didn't involve continuing to drown in it, and that these women, in turn, had given me back something I genuinely believed David had permanently taken. On her last evening, sitting on my small balcony watching the sky over Puerto Princesa go from orange to deep violet, Melissa said something I will likely remember for the rest of my life. I chose David over you for almost a year, Mom. I don't know how to ever fully make that right. I told her, honestly, that I didn't believe she needed to fully make it right in some single dramatic gesture, only that she needed to keep choosing, going forward, to believe me, the way she hadn't during those darkest months. She has, in the year and a half since that visit, done exactly that. Calling weekly now, visiting twice more, slowly, carefully rebuilding something that I do not believe will ever look exactly the way it did before David's betrayal, but that feels increasingly, genuinely solid again. David's case, as of the recording of this video, remains in its final legal stages, though the licensing board's decision has already been finalized. His career in financial services permanently ended. Melissa divorced him roughly a year after that first tearful phone call. Once the full scope of everything became undeniable even to her, and is, by her own account, slowly rebuilding her own life as a single mother to my 2 grandchildren. A process I try to support from thousands of miles away as best I can, while remaining myself, genuinely and unexpectedly content in the life I've built here. I am 69 years old now, living on considerably less than I ever imagined I would need to build a secure retirement around, in a small apartment in a city I had never once heard of before the worst year of my entire life forced me to go looking for it. My monthly expenses here, rent, food, the occasional dinner out with Corazon and Feely, come to somewhere around 45,000 pesos, just under $800, a figure my remaining Social Security and the modest fraction of my teaching pension that survived David's activities covers comfortably, with room left over that simply did not exist during those final frightening months in Savannah, watching a mortgage I could not sustainably pay accumulate against a home I no longer even fully trusted myself to have understood the paperwork on. I wake up most mornings and walk to a small cafe near the market, where Corazon and Feely and I have become, over these past 2 years, something considerably closer to family than the family that nearly cost me everything I had. My Saturdays belong to a room full of women learning, through the hardest lesson of my own life, how to protect themselves from exactly what happened to me. And I have never, in 69 years, felt more genuinely useful in the world than I do sitting across that table from them. I think often about that conference room at my bank, about the loan officer sliding that piece of paper across the table, about the specific, particular shock of discovering that the person you trust most completely can sometimes be the very person who takes everything from you. I do not believe that pain has fully left me, and I don't think it ever entirely will. But I have learned, at an age when most people assume every major lesson of their life is already behind them, that betrayal, however devastating, does not have to be the final chapter. Sometimes, if you're willing to rebuild from considerably less than you ever thought you'd have to work with, it can simply become the painful beginning of a chapter you never once expected to need. I still think some evenings about the version of my life I would be living right now if that letter had never arrived, if David's scheme had simply continued undetected for however many more years it might have taken to fully collapse. I don't allow myself to dwell there long, because I don't believe it serves anything useful, but I acknowledge it honestly, the way I've come to acknowledge most of what happened, rather than continuing to bury it the way I did during those first frightened months. What I know for certain is that the woman sitting on this balcony tonight, watching the sky over Puerto Princesa fade toward evening, understands considerably more about her own resilience than the woman who once sat quietly, signing whatever papers were placed in front of her at a family dinner table, trusting completely, asking nothing. If there is one thing I would want another woman watching this, sitting somewhere right now, discovering her own version of that letter in the mailbox to understand, it is this. You are allowed to grieve what was taken from you, and you are also allowed at the exact same time to build something entirely new from whatever remains. I built mine in an underground river, in a room full of Saturday morning students, in a friendship with women who understood exactly what I'd survived without needing it explained to them twice. If this story meant something to you, I would be grateful if you would like this video and subscribe. There are more stories like mine, and I believe you will find them worth your time. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I will see you in the next.